Hey, Chris.
Hey
How you
there.
doing?
How's it going? I'm well. How are you?
Oh, good. Good to hear it. I'm happy to have you back on the show. So, welcome back. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah. Last time we had you on the show, you're part of the panel around Datastar, and that was cool. Now we're going to talk about event sourcing, but we'll find a way to tie it back to Datastar just a bit, I think. I see it on the horizon or in the show
Yeah.
notes.
Sounds
One
good.
of these. Yeah, well, not everyone listens to every episode. We've got new listeners coming all the time. So give us the quick intro. Who are you, Chris?
Who am I? Let's see. I am a Python developer for about 20 years and a longtime listener to the show. So it's a very big privilege to be on finally, my own self. um, and by the way, great job continuing going, Michael. You're constantly putting out great content. So I really
Thank you.
appreciate all your work. But as far as me, I learned to program as an adult. A friend suggested I learn Python. I hitched my wagon to this engine, and I've loved it ever since. I was a technical coach for a little while. I started the Python group here in Richmond, Virginia, PyRVA. So if you're local, come out. In fact, we're just 2 weeks away from the next meeting.
Awesome. How
Yeah,
frequently do you have meetings?
once a month now. In fact, if you look behind me, you can see all these blue dots are the meetings. So it
Oh,
helps me to
okay. Excellent.
keep planning.
What are some of the kind of topics you all have?
Oh man, we range pretty much whatever we can figure out that people are interested in. We've had a number of AI discussions. In fact, those have been really powerful. We've kind of lined up the chairs in a big circle and just have a discussion, and it's really incredible. You have people on the whole spectrum of opinions about AI. So yeah, it was very very. That was one of my favorite. Uh, I was going to say episodes, one of the favorite meetings.
Yeah.
Um,
I
but
think we might bookend this podcast episode with little AI at the start, little AI at the end.
sounds good.
Cool. So, yeah, people just go attend that. And I guess probably on meetup.com is where they find you.
It is, yeah. And you can go to pyrva.org to get to the meetup page. Either
Yeah,
way,
easiest way. Because you can
yeah,
find a lot of crazy stuff. You probably find people like with pet pythons that want to meet up in Virginia as well. And it's not the same thing.
indeed, yeah. Thankfully, and we are, gosh, over 10 years old, so we are one of the first ones that pop up just because of age. I think sometimes, although
Yeah.
honestly, some of the newer ones pop up ahead of us sometimes too. So you know,
Yeah, it's such a contentious topic, this AI stuff, talking about your meetup. How did that go? Were people frustrated? Were people excited? Like,
yeah, it was a kind of the whole spectrum. I felt like it was great because everybody respected each other, and there were, I'd say, two people on each anchored on each of the sides. Two people who actually I think maybe there are three people who have bought their own hardware and are really going deep into AI and encouraging people to like really dig into it. And we had two people who were very AI skeptic and very you know worried about the environment, all sorts of different things. And so I thought it was a very healthy, very good discussion. Um, you know, I walked away with a healthier respect for both sides. Some ideas that I incorporated into my work, especially now that the company I work for gives us a mandate to use AI to write every piece of code. So that's been a very fascinating transition for me, but also gives me a little bit of agency or a little bit of permission to experiment and see what to do. How to actually function in this new
yeah,
paradigm.
it is engineering. And we'll talk about it more later, but it's quite wild that your that is the position. I don't necessarily think it's the wrong position. I think it might be the right one, but I think it's got to be brought on this is a skill you need to learn, not just throw stuff at the chat bot and now that's your job. Like these are
Yeah,
not the same things. But I think a
I
lot of
agree.
people do, especially when they're getting started, treat them as the same thing and then
Yeah,
say it doesn't work and then they're
yeah,
frustrated.
totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
All right,
both
more of
decline
that.
to speak further about certain things, but yes, I agree.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. Well, we'll come back to that and get there. But let's talk about a little bit of this event sourcing thing.
Yeah,
What exactly is event sourcing?
that's a question. Okay, cool. I wasn't sure if you had more. I saw your.
No. I think I when you reached out and said, "Hey, let's talk about this," I'm like, so let's take a step back.
Okay.
Design patterns, refactoring ideas, like all of these architecture. I love to talk about this stuff. I love to think about this stuff. I think also maybe that's one of the reasons I'm not super frustrated with the AI things, because I will tell it, I want you to use, like, you could say, like, I want to build a system with event sourcing and it's going to work this way. Like, for me, the fun is like, oh, I got to build something with event sourcing. It clicks together with this and it does that. And like, yeah, I didn't have to do all the little checks and details and like the file IO, but whatever. Like, I can skip that and build just like, think a little bit bigger and a little more big building blocks. So I'm a big fan of design patterns and paying attention to what you're doing. I can tell that you are too.
Yes, especially event sourcing, I would say. So I have been following the topic of event sourcing for over a decade. I listened to a podcast with a couple developers in the PHP realm, and they were talking about event sourcing, and it just inspired me. Specifically, the things that I really loved. Before I was a programmer, I was a graphic designer, and so creating websites with exceptional user experiences is something that just makes me excited. And at the time, I was working at a creative agency, building websites that would just get slower and slower and slower the more data we put into it, or the more we configure the routing and or the navigation and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so the thought of never having a slow page load again was intoxicating to me.
Yeah.
However, that was in a portion of my career where I had so much imposter syndrome, having learned to program as an adult, and I just felt like I couldn't suggest to my lead developer, we should lean into this. And even when I was a lead developer, I just didn't feel confident that I could lead a whole team into like a redesign of the code. But a couple of years ago, I got laid off, and I was like, you know what? I've been wanting to explore event sourcing for 10 years. I'm going to do it. And it turns out it was a lot easier than I thought. But anyway, all this to say, let me define event sourcing, since I've kind of danced around it. Event sourcing has to do with how you save data to the database. The best way to contrast it is most apps are kind of CRUD based, right? So you create a table, like let's say you're a shopping cart application. You have a table called carts, and you have a bunch of columns, and one of the columns has data for the product IDs that are in the cart. And so if you have that kind of situation and you have one user who adds 5 items to the cart, then removes 2 and then checks out, and then you have another user who adds just 3 items to the cart and checks out. Well, if they check out at the same time and you look at the 2 database rows, they are very similar.
They're the same user, basically. They get put in the same cohort from your marketing side, right?
Yeah, they both of them checked out exactly the same products, and if you look at the database, you'd have no idea that one of them removed 2 items from their shopping cart. Mm-hmm. So event sourcing, so the reason that is because CRUD-based, applications will mutate state in the database to ensure it's always up to date with the current state and optimized for data integrity. Event sourcing, on the other hand, captures every change that happens within the system. So you would have an event of like cart created, item added to cart, item added to cart. You'd have 5 item added to cart events and 2 removals. And so you could have the whole history of how each user interacts with your system in the database. That is essentially the core of event sourcing. Everything else is actually adding more design patterns onto event sourcing, which is really wonderful, but that is what event sourcing is.
Right. So your database sort of becomes almost an audit log. It feels very source control ish. Feels like Git,
Yeah.
right? Like what you
Yeah.
store is the file and then the diff, then the diff, then the diff.
Uh-huh.
And you get back to the file by running all the operations on it potentially.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. And it's funny because, like, I don't know about you, but like when I first heard about this, I'm like, well, isn't it slower? Because it just seems like you're doing so much more work. Every time you're updating the cart, you're pulling out all the events from the event store and building up the state of where it's at right now and saying, okay, does that cart exist does that item exist in the cart? Can I remove it? Okay, let's remove it. And it turns out computers are fast. And so it's negligibly slower depending on the query. Yeah.
So I saw you and Bob Belder both talking about this on YouTube. And that was one of my first thoughts too, was like, this is super cool, but it's kind of sounds a lot slower to answer questions.
Yeah.
And I think, but then I thought about it and I think there's actually a decent amount of stuff that you can do to make it quite a bit faster, right? So let me throw some ideas out to you and then you tell me how they land as somebody who's actually done this stuff. First of all, back to your comment on computers are fast. Computers are so fast. They're so much faster than people realize how fast they are. And databases are fast too. If you put indexes on them, then they're so much faster. Like, I just don't understand how websites are slow. It's not just, oh, I'm a little frustrated. It's like, how is it possible that somebody built this and accepted that it takes 3 seconds to load this page? And yet they do. And you just know that it's most likely that there's not a database index somewhere, or maybe in an extreme situation, there should be better caching. But it's just like, so like when done right, you're right. It's absolutely blazes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But how you could make it faster. So a couple of thoughts that came to mind. One was, I have 3. So one is you could have a operational database, which has, for a particular user, it might have the 5 adds, 2 removals, and that's their shopping cart. And the way you get that is either you query it and then code, you add it up, or you do some kind of aggregation thing that says, get all these things and then somehow plus minus them together, right?
Yeah.
Probably in the shopping cart, it feels like you probably need to actually pull them back. But still, you could do that super quick and then just run that bit of code. And every time you make a change, you could also write that to a second table, a second database that doesn't have it just has the current state, right? It just has 3 for that user shopping cart. That sounds okay to me, but databases hate duplication. That's like kind of their third normal form job.
Do databases hate duplication, or is it people that don't like it?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. They were built to avoid duplication, right? So in that sense. So, but another possibility would just be use something like Valkey. I could have said Redis, but I'm a fan of Valkey over Redis. I find this is like a little bit nicer project. I don't know, are you familiar with Valkey?
I am not, and I'm taking notes mentally right now.
Yeah, here we go. So Valkey, if I find its repository, which is hiding down here, it describes itself. Where does it describe itself? It's a fork of the open source Redis project right before the transition to their new source available but not open source models. So if you have, say, the Redis Python library, you just tell it that it talks to this thing, this endpoint, this IP address and port, and it thinks it's Redis, right? But it's like more open source friendly. I'm going to star it for the world. So, and it's got 26,000 stars, right? So it's pretty popular. Not that it's totally really relevant exactly which version this is, but just having a cache that has that information of what is, shopping cart is 3, period.
Yeah.
And just put 2 pieces in place. One, when you do a query, first you check the cache. If it's not there, you get the playback, you compute it, and you put it in the cache. And if you make any change to that thing, then you invalidate the cache, right? Those 2 things would give you basically seamless, ephemeral answers to the questions that if you ask them very often, you get super quick responses, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then the other one is if I always find like these extra caching servers are honestly not necessary. Like, we already talked about fast. So I'm a big fan of disk cache, which
Yeah,
I
yeah.
had Vincent Warmerdam on to talk about. And disk cache is awesome. So you could just have like a local file store on your Docker image or volume or whatever. And then you get the same thing, but you don't have to have the infrastructure, right? There's different
Hmm.
options. So basically, I guess to sum this up, I'll throw it to you now. Operational database that also has the answers or some kind of caching story. It could be in memory. It could be a server val key. It could be the disk cache, whatever. What do you think about those? Are you
I think
guys
all
exploring them?
I am exploring essentially, yeah, I guess you could say all three in a way. Um, I'm experimenting with Nats to do kind of the, I guess, Redis kind of side of it. But all that to say is all three are viable options depending on your use case. Um, the first thing is like just the event store itself. Like you getting the current state of any individual item should not take, essentially should take milliseconds, if that long. Um, so there are two people that I kind of who are my North Star for all of my event sourcing knowledge. They are
Okay.
Martin Dilger and Adam Dimitriuk. And Martin wrote a book called Understanding Event Sourcing, which was huge to helping me go from somebody who created an event sourcing project to adopting event sourcing as my kind of default strategy. And in the book, he mentioned that he will tend to use the event store for essentially, like, if you start hitting 2,000 events in a stream, then he'll think about optimizing it, changing, going to one of the alternate approaches that we just mentioned. So, like, that's really impressive. He uses Java or one of the Java derivative languages, so chances are it's slower in Python, and so you need, that we need to adjust that number for Python. But honestly, we should have shorter event streams anyway.
2,000 seems like a lot.
It does.
Seems like a lot.
And so kind of the first fallback for me would be the what Martin and Adam call the read model, which is essentially one way you can make a read model would be the database backed read model, where you have code that subscribes to only the events it cares about. And so whenever an event comes in, it'll incrementally update that database cache or your file cache or Redis cache or whatever. And then I guess the third thing that I appreciate is, using like Redis or in my case Nats, is like when you have a, front end, a very high frequency, high updating, web UI or something that you want to really make sure that the user has up-to-date information, I would lean towards that, having ways to push down to the client.
Okay. Yeah. Anytime you've got a live stream, seems perfect, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, hook up some JavaScript or hook in some textual or whatever it is you're trying to do and just say, or just ran, arbitrary WebSockets or service and events and just say, when this changes, send me the delta and then we'll adjust.
Yeah.
Right, which is pretty nice.
Yeah.
So there's a book that you recommended by one of the guys you mentioned, Martin Dilger.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell people about that real quick.
Yeah. This is incredible to me. He realized there was a gap. One of the biggest problems with event sourcing is that the material is sometimes there's gaps in where there's good material. And because event sourcing came out of the domain-driven design community, there's a lot of jargon that you have to kind of get through. And
they do like their jargon in the DDD space. They really do.
And once you understand it, it makes perfect sense. But yeah, getting onboarded does take
get your bounded context working and then off the races.
Yeah, exactly. And so Martin essentially saw this gap in knowledge and was like, I need to fill this with an ebook. And I can't remember, I want to say in like 2 months he wrote this thing, and it's so amazing because it introduces the way that the two of them work. Like they both independently kind of came to similar conclusions, which is to use event sourcing as your base, but to also leverage one main other, or whatever, a couple other patterns, vertical slice architecture, CQRS, which is kind of that idea of like having those read models ready to optimized for you to download and use, and then using a documentation technique called event modeling diagrams. And that is a huge key too, because as someone who has been on a couple teams to do the event-driven transition to try to really help, do more asynchronously, you need to have a good communication pattern to keep everybody up to date on what does what. And I find that all three, especially the event modeling diagram, they have refined this to make it simpler and simpler and simpler to the point where there's really just a few elements put together and you can understand the whole life cycle of an application.
Yeah, cool. I'll link to the book over on Amazon. Another before we carry on, I thought of another sort of optimized scenario. What about a document database like Mongo?
Yeah.
Your top level elements are just like the computed fields, like total lifetime value, or cart value, or cart count, item count. But then have like maybe a cart item events, which could be a nested list of like rich, many documents that are like item added, timestamp, value, like category, all, and actually storing them in the same record.
Yeah. I haven't tried that, but I think it's a really interesting approach. I actually use a document database as my as my event store, and I haven't really kind of dug into like kind of the optimizations I could do, but I find it curious because like what you're suggesting is slightly different than how I think about it, because it sounds like you have like for lack of a better word, a model that you're storing all of its events in as well. And some of the neat, it's
kind of inside out of what the real design pattern is, right?
Well, it's not so much that as much as one thing that I have found interesting is, since this came out of the domain-driven design group, everything is about an aggregate, what they call aggregate. Many people call it a model. And so you set up boundaries of this is your shopping cart, and these are the events that modify the shopping cart. What has been new movement in event sourcing is to essentially be model less, is to like focus on the events themselves, because they are so flexible, and so many times we as developers can kind of create boundaries around what we think are the models. But
the models change.
Yeah. And coupling is like the hardest.
The bounded context, as they would say, actually changes because the problem you're solving might change and the models don't match.
Exactly. Yeah. So all that to say is, I want to especially say, like, I don't think that that's a bad idea. I think it could be really fascinating, especially as like a secondary approach, because whatever, like one of the things I really find fascinating about this is such a flexible pattern that people, they've done so many different ways of optimizing for their event store or anything like this. So I think that's very much a valid approach.
It's the reason that came to mind is you can atomically update documents, and therefore you could atomically update both the computed value and the series of events as a single action, which is interesting,
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting.
And they kind of that one thing becomes the source of truth for what you're tracking. There might be something there. But it does sound a little bit too focused on the model. I do think
it's worth experimenting with, for sure.
Yep. So just to throw out a little street cred there, look at this. Purchased April 18th, 2005 for Domain-Driven Design by Eric Evans. So this is kind of the greater space, right? Maybe the book is called Domain-Driven Design, Tackling the Complexity in the Heart of Software. It's pretty interesting. I think it's kind of the follow-on of the refactoring movement that Martin Fowler and all those folks were working on, like in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
Kind of in that space, right?
Yeah. I must say I haven't bought that book. The closest I've come is the Cosmic Python book, or the Architecture Patterns in Python book that Hardy and Oh, I always forget the other guy's name. But that's such an amazing book. So that's the closest I've
Yeah.
come to DDD.
Okay. Cool. Cool. There's a video. I think you gave me this video, right? Event sourcing explained using football.
Yeah.
And this looks like foosball type football, not American football. Which is
Indeed.
I love American football, but I do believe it's slightly misnamed. Like you don't use your feet that much, other than the running
Yeah.
part.
Yeah. True that.
I mean, it's like calling like Formula One like foot car because you make the car go with your foot, but like it's not really the main thing of the sport anyway.
Yeah. But
So
yeah,
I'll
I
put
love
that
this
link.
video.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell people about it. I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, this is well, like I feel like event sourcing, it's like one of those things where it's hard to explain until you get it. And then I feel like it's like a good board game. You know, if you have a board game fan in your life, they're like, oh, this is such a great board game. It's so simple. And then they start explaining it. And like half an hour later, you're like, are we ever going to actually play this? I don't know that I want to anymore. But I felt like this person has done a really good job of kind of really distilling it down and showing like why it matters. And it's a 10-minute video, 5 minutes at 2x. And it's really kind of charming, really good, really well done.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. I'll put it on there. Can you watch videos at 2x? Are you one of those
Yeah, all the
people?
time. Yeah.
Gosh, my daughter does that. I'm like, how do you actually take it in? I'm a 1x sort of person. So.
Do slow it down or rewind to pull in things, but yeah.
I see. It's like a seek and then focus sort of deal. Got it.
Exactly.
Not that one. This one. I also heard there's this ebook I can get. What's up with this?
Yeah. So scheduling this podcast episode, I didn't know, what we're going to talk about. And I know like there's going to be things I forget. And I feel like part of the reason I am so excited about this is I know that there's someone like me, the 10-year ago version of me, who has heard about these things and is curious, but just needs more information. And so I've spent the last couple of weeks creating this ebook, and I put the first version up, and I'm going to continue to improve it as time goes on. So if anything in this conversation is interesting to you and you just need a little bit more and you want to understand a little bit more what's going on, absolutely download it. And it's free, so why not?
Yeah. Cool. And then we'll have to make you do an audio version. Put that on Audible or something like that.
Sounds good. Yeah, sure.
I always want to do audiobooks for stuff that I'm working on, but just the concept of trying to speak code or config file, I just like, okay, I got to stop. It's tough. It's a tough balance to do with audiobooks and tech, like developer stuff, but still.
For sure.
Yeah, cool. All right, so people can check that out. It's for free. We'll put that in the show notes. Now, I think that this both has really positive or really big possibilities for data science, but also
Absolutely.
potential challenges. Let me throw it out to you, and then you take us through it. Super benefits, incredibly obvious. You have an event stream that tells you over time what times the things happened. You have both the additions and subtractions, or the permutations that it goes through until it ends up in its final state. Not just show me all the customers from California who bought this month, but like show me all the Californias who abandoned the cart but then came back and then did the, you know what I mean? Like you can just answer way more interesting questions. You got time series. On the other hand, maybe I would just want to load up a pandas data frame with the answers of what's the average cart size during checkout. And that becomes like a big computation out of an event source based database. If you don't
Not
have one of the things
necessarily.
okay,
Well,
let's hear it. Let's hear it. I'm just saying, like if you don't do one of those caching or multi-database things or the QRS, I don't remember the patterns. Anyway, that looks like it maybe is a little bit of a challenge. You could do it. I think you could do it more easily in pandas, but like maybe I just, some people do data science just through SQL, and they just,
Right.
like, I'm just
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
write queries against a warehouse database,
Yeah, absolutely. Why not have it both ways? For example, so let's start. For the hardcore data scientists, actually, I don't even think the event store is the right format for them.
Okay.
I would definitely have some kind of script that would run on some kind of loop that, maybe every day or every couple hours or whatever would transform the raw events into some format that would be great for
Sure.
data
And you hear
science.
about all these like OLAP cubes and all these other like super BI type of systems. None of
Yeah.
those, I can't say none of those. Many of those are not running out of the operational database. They're like some kind of like warehouse data lake. We've transformed this so you answer questions. So it's not necessarily just event sourcing. Like we just want to avoid 5 joins so we can just ask the question directly, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, my current project that I have in production at work, uh, it is a service that multiple other services use to process items. And the project manager of one of these services reached out to me and said that they have a big query table that has all this analytical information, and they wanted to add the information we have to theirs. And so, we set up a conversation. I created the code, and every day I'm sending information to their BigQuery instance. And 3 days after we did a go live, I created a meeting to like kind of circle back with them to make sure everything's working the way they wanted. And when they opened up the BigQuery database, they were shocked because they were expecting 3 days worth of data. I set every piece of data I had for months, which was how long they've been sending things to my service. And so, like, this person was elated because they were like, they knew their data scientists wanted this information, and now they
Yeah.
have all this information going back to day one, so to speak. And also, just recently, my boss asked me, like, I have a reports view that's just a web page that has like how stats on how my service is doing, and he's like, it'd be nice to have like some like a table of some of these last few days or whatever. And I was like, okay, how many days would you like? And he's like, 30 days. So I created the HTML was pretty easy, and I just created a script to like pull the events out of the event store and populate this table, as exactly as we needed. It went into production live, and we were immediately there with 30 days of history. It was so exciting, and like this is what I get to experience every week is like, having the ability to like go back into history and answer questions that we've had that we didn't even think we knew. We didn't have any idea that we would want to know, a month ago, and to be able to answer those questions with precision is intoxicating.
Yeah. I certainly see the value. Like you don't necessarily know the questions you're going to ask. And if you don't have enough data or you don't store it in the right way, you literally can't answer them.
Yeah.
Right. But it sounds like with event source, you can go back and like, well, what if we ask this over time instead of by region? Like, okay, slightly different query, no problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's really quite something. I had no idea. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, my biggest thing was I can't wait to have fast UI. And now that I realize that, I feel like our applications obviously serve the primary purpose of whatever it is that the business needs. But I didn't realize how much there was a secondary need of understanding how it works and enabling the business to make decisions based on how customers are actually using the application.
We're going to talk about the AI side later. But I do just want to throw out as different constituents who might care to answer these questions. Like I was just thinking, you've got the operational side of say the website or app or driving an API for the app or something like that. That's one view. That's kind of the traditional view. But now you have this much more increasingly popular view of like data scientists and BI tools, and the CEO wants a dashboard that updates live type, so events are a clear trigger for those kind of things, right?
Absolutely.
But then also you might ask your AI, Opus or Codex or whatever, hey, find me some trends, or let's look at this. And, it has more to work with as well, right?
Yeah.
Just thinking of the different
Absolutely.
constituencies. Yeah.
Totally. In fact, just today I was looking into a bug that was happening in production, and I asked Claude, "Hey, can you query the GCP logs? Can you query the event store and help me understand what's going on?" And it was like, "Sure enough, here you go," and made fixing the bug much easier.
Yeah, I guess you know why. You have more granularity on what if the thing in the database doesn't look like you expected. You have a much more granular way of knowing, like, it was this step that made it look like that. Because I've had problems before where I completely upgraded, changed, swapped out the data access layer for Talk Python training for the courses. And
Yeah.
for the website, it was perfect. Everything was great. But under certain circumstances on Android, the app was resulting in something, it was sitting in something that would make the data not right, right? Like there was some field that was null instead of just taking on the default value,
Oh man.
which is fine. But then when the person logged in on the website didn't assume that that thing could be null because it was at a minimum had a non-nullable default value. I'm like, why do we need to check this for null? Like it should, how did it get to be null? It makes no sense. It took forever to figure that out.
Oh wow.
But with event sourcing, you could see this was the event that made it null, not just it is null. What in the world is going on? How could it possibly be null?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think it's got some interesting debugging sides. And one more thing, like I know this is not quite the data science side, but another constituency could be PCI, HIPAA, GDPR, like all the compliance frameworks you got to deal with. Where auditing or a sort of audit trail or something happens. I mean, a lot of times logs serve that value, but that might be they updated the record, like to what?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And that, even though I've been in insurance and I've been in healthcare, I haven't had anything where I have to certify these things, but like the audit log is the way you interact with everything. It is the source of truth. And so, but what's funny is I have worked on teams that created history tables to try to essentially do that work. And it was like 2 or 3 months after I started working there before I learned that that table existed. And so there were 2 or 3 months of work I should have been putting in the history table that I didn't. And from what I hear among other developers, a lot of teams work that way. Like only a few people really know and understand how to maintain that history table. And a lot of times, like when they try to replay it, it just doesn't work. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's like, well, there's history in the history table, but when we run it again, we don't get the same output as the final database. What's going on?
Yeah, true.
Yeah, but with the event sourcing, it reverses it. And basically, the events are the source of truth, and the other one is some kind of dynamically generated sort of deal. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a lot like a backup strategy. If you never test your backup strategy,
you don't have backups.
Exactly. And I feel like the same thing with the history table. And honestly, to be totally honest, event sourcing is similar in that it's easy to accidentally migrate event versions. Like for myself, I was working on a new event to kind of on my app, and I introduced a new attribute, or actually, I guess it was a full whatever. The point being is, at some point, I decided I wanted to change the name of the attribute because it would reflect better what it meant in the domain, and not realizing that I had already published that event to production. And so at one point, I don't know, I don't even remember what I was doing, looking up issues, or honestly, it might have been the view that it was rendering that was supposed to be for was throwing errors, and I couldn't understand why. And I looked at it, and sure enough, it was because I accidentally created a different version of the same event. Thankfully, all I had to do was change the code to say, well, if this attribute doesn't exist, look for this attribute, and everything was fixed. But you can honestly fall into some of those things with event sourcing too if you're not careful. But the nice thing is because the events are still there, you have the ability to recover from them.
Yeah, let's talk about versioning for a little bit.
Sure.
On a sort of operational third normal form type of database, you might run a migration. It's one of the reasons I really like using MongoDB is because I almost never have to run migrations, but that's a different, it's a different debate. However, you might run the migration to say like, okay, we're going to add a column, or we're going to split this data apart and move this stuff over here and that over there, and then create a foreign key relationship or whatever.
Yeah.
But I can see if you've got this kind of history of things, like let's say, I don't know, how do you deal with versioning, right? Like I've got these old events, and the way you're not storing the current state. So with a migration or something like that, you're like, well, let's just transform the current state into the new state. With these, you've got like old events and new events, and they might be in a real way incompatible.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So
What do you think about with that?
you have so many strategies. You just have to choose which one works for your situation. So the first one is kind of what I mentioned just a minute ago, kind of like the MongoDB, or I should say document database way of working with things, where if you're adding things to an event, adding fields, then if if the code, most code will be blissfully ignorant that you're adding new attributes to it, so it doesn't really matter. And then those that do care can kind of have fallbacks. And the way that Adam and Martin suggest, you essentially have like upcasters, or some kind of code that essentially says like, okay, the previous version, actually that's two different things. I'm sorry. The code that does care about the new attribute, if it encounters an older event that doesn't have that attribute, then you can have a default fallback. And it's best to have those close to the domain logic that you want to update. This is a vertical slice architecture approach, as opposed to having like a global upcaster. Again, I said upcaster. I realized that I want to keep going to the upcasting, which is the second option that I've been trying to get to. So essentially, one is have a default fallback. Second one is to have an upcaster that says, okay, especially if they're two different versions, like truly different versions of the event. You have add to shopping, or item added and item added version 2. You might have completely different fields. It's good to have a piece of code that can upcast to the second one. Those are the
Maybe put that in your data access layer. You might write a thing that say, give me all the items out of the cart, and it looks at the type or the version flag and then does a little processing. Or would you rewrite the database?
Oh, well, I was going to say that's your third option. So let me take a step back and ask your last question, which was, like, at least to me, what you're doing with your events is essentially rebuilding state. And so wherever you're in that loop to rebuild the state, you would probably say like, oh, is it this event or is it this event, or whatever, behave this way.
Right there. Like in my story of using one of the data caches. Right?
Yeah.
You do a request. It's not in the cache. So you got to run your build it up code, then put it in the cache. And that just that part right there would be the part that goes, okay, we're going to transform it differently now. And then we'll still store the answer in the cache. And next time they ask, it's just fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, you would have, the way I would code it is, you would have a piece of code that's listening into the events. So it knows about the old version of the event and the new version of the event. And it knows what format that data needs to be in that Redis cache, or whatever it was that you suggested.
Yeah, Valky. Come on, Valky. Let's go. Let's go, Valky.
I'm going to remember this by the end of the conversation. So what it does is it will be able to say like, okay, this event is an old one, but I can upcast it to the new one and convert it into the format or however we need to save it to Valky. And then if it's a new one, it also knows, okay, I'm going to convert it this way to save it to Valky. So it's nice that it's kind of localized to the process that you need to upcast.
Yeah.
And then we touched on like kind of the quote unquote nuclear option, which is to apply a transform to your entire event store. And so by doing that, you would create a new database or new database table, which would be your new event store. And for each event, you just copy it over, do some kind of map or transform to upcast your entire history.
Yeah. I see value in all of them. If you're doing a lot of direct SQL data sciencey stuff, you probably want to transform the database. If it's primarily coming out of an API, like just let that thing handle it as it reads them. Computers are fast. Keep it in mind.
Indeed. And I forgot to mention that, his name escapes me right now. The guy who popularized event sourcing back in the 2000s wrote a book on this topic specifically. So he kind of listed out all your strategies and when you would want to choose them and why. And
are we talking Martin Dilger?
No,
someone else?
Greg Young.
Greg Young. Okay.
I think it's on Lean Pub. Yeah, that sounds about right. In fact, Martin Dilger's book is cheaper on Lean Pub as well, and you get additional content there too.
Okay.
So,
yeah, very interesting. Let's make this a little bit concrete for people.
Sure.
So we talked about how you might, in theory, architect some software, could be Python or something else, to follow these patterns. But there is a Python library, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you recommend it?
I do. It's funny. I don't have any production code with it, but I have used it a lot over the years. John Bywater has done an incredible job maintaining this repo and all his all the people who have contributed as well. He has shepherded this through and has been really making it such an incredible application. When I wrote my applications, the first one I did, I was like, I want to do it myself so I can understand it, and so I can really understand and respect what he's done. But also, there's a part of me that really like a lot of the, essentially, I feel like it depends on who you are. If you're somebody who wants to grab a framework and run with it, this is an exceptional one to do it with. It essentially, you just write Python classes and you decorate them or subclass from some of his classes, and all the magic of event sourcing happens for you, and it just leaves you with really readable, understandable code. And then you'll have other people who, a lot of people in the event sourcing space says it's actually not that complicated. You can write your own code to do it. And I did, and I recommend it for the right type of person. For me, it was hard because there's so many decisions that you need to make, and I am not the best Python programmer. I do not know all the concurrency issues and all these things. I'm getting to learn them more. But I have software that's running in production that's doing well. So all that to say is, I highly recommend this package, especially if you're new to it. It can really show you, how one option of things can work. And I love that it by default it uses, you can use SQLite, Postgres, or a couple of the databases that are optimized for event sourcing, and so you can kind of see how it, some of the many ways you can pattern things to make it easy for you.
Interesting. So probably need to file a PR or something here. It says the way you get it is pip install event sourcing. I feel like it should be UV pip install event sourcing. No, just kidding. But that's cool. However, I am, so it's, you can get it off PyPI, but I'm having a hard time resisting pressing this. Ask DeepWiki. If you've ever gone, what is DeepWiki?
Yeah. It's an AI powered document thing that he opted into, which I thought was very fascinating. I was following. At the time he did it. I think I was writing my own code, and so I had Slack open. He has a good Slack channel, and was like showing all the things that he was able to all the insights that was able to be gleaned from it.
Oh, this is epic. I love it. So the DeepWiki apparently is like knows the source. And the docs, and then it's just a chat. And even on Fast, I said, give me an example using this library. It says, sure, here's a complete example of dog school application. And all the code using event source, the package. Dang, this is nuts.
Yeah.
All right, I'm new. Side quest unlocked. Must figure out how to get my packages into DeepWiki. This is neat.
Nice. And I also want to add, he has other companion packages that, for example, connect into Django and I believe Flask and some other ones too. So one of my side projects, I'm leveraging this with Django, and it's really cool because one of the things that it enables you to do is configure your events table to be similar to or I guess in the same database as your Django table, or at least configurable from the way Django would do it. And so getting all these read models are very easy with all the migrations. You just say, this is what I want my data to look like with Django. And of course, apply migrations, and there it is in production. So it's really nice.
Yeah, cool. It also has extension projects. What are these? The Django one, the current DB, KURRENT. Imagine current DB is probably I
believe that is, it's one of the first event sourcing specific databases. I think it was called.
It's for intelligent and responsive systems. I don't know, Chris, I just got to rant a little bit. Like, there's all these projects that are cool and they do neat stuff. And now I feel when I go to them, it's like, this is the AI compute data frame, or this is the AI, the intelligent AI. It's like, it's just a database or just a data frame.
Yeah,
that AIs can use. That doesn't make it an AI data frame. It's like, but they all want to capture the excitement. It drives me crazy.
Yeah. And what's worse is when they don't even say exactly what they do. It is your answer for AIing the thing that we're not going to tell you. I hate it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it just obscures what the heck it is, but it's the H1 and the H2. You're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But that does look pretty interesting. Like, yeah, look, its example is create a client, new event data, new UUID, etc. Order placed, serialized. So right here, this example is basically it's got a primary key, a category or type of event, like just an event, I guess is the way you would call it. But then it has JSON serialized, like a JSON blob that is the details of the event. Is this how you typically do it?
I
Or
would say so.
is it more column oriented where like this one has an order ID and a total? So you might have an order ID and a total in the data structure, or is it in a blob level?
Yeah, the implementations I've seen generally will have some kind of blob or JSON serialized or bytecode serialized um, optimization of it. Because each event, when you're saving things to a database, you're going to save an event. It's going to have an event stream. It's going to have generally speaking, there's probably an event version. There's all these specific things, but the actual
If
payload
there's
of the
not
event.
an event version, you're going to wish there was an event version at some point, probably.
Exactly. Yes. And so the payload is usually some kind of blob or JSON body or something like that.
It sounds very good to be a document database.
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, because you can put indexes on like the sub items, and then if they're not in that event, it just doesn't use the index for those particular ones. I mean, it's
Bada bing. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's pretty sweet.
Yeah. And again, well, I haven't said it quite, but like one of the things have been thinking about for a decade is the more I kind of thought about it, the event sourcing and the patterns it unlocks really gives you so much flexibility. You can use document data stores and like really take the power of that. If you have and part of this is just data, vertical slicing or whatever. It's both multiple patterns put together. But like, if you have a view that would be so much better served by having a graph query, a graph database, then use it. It's I remember at one time it took me a while, but like somebody told me that they were using I can't remember their open query, is that what it's called? The I forgot the old name of what I'm trying to think of, but essentially it's like a database that optimizes for saving text, so you can like search for it.
Yeah.
They use that as just for one, to serve the purpose of one item. And honestly, this isn't unique to event sourcing. You can do this with event-driven architecture as well. But what I love about event sourcing is like you have the benefits of event-driven architecture and the benefits of a monolith in one, if you choose to go that way. And yeah, it's I guess really what it comes down to is what I love about it and was surprised by is how flexible it gives you the ability. Yeah, in the book, it reminds me, one of my users was complaining about the status screen that I show for the users. And he had all these great ideas. And I was like, you know what? I want to take advantage of that. So I actually cloned the vertical slice for that view and created a new database column or collection for that to power that view. And we iterated and iterated to make this thing better. And with each iteration, sometimes I needed to change how the read model reacted to events. And so I could just blow away the read model, regenerate it from events. And we ended up with something really great. So that when it was time to go live, I just changed where the URL went, pointed to the new one, and was able to delete the old code and delete the database table. And it was wonderful.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. It just gives you so much flexibility to do whatever you need.
So one more really relevant thing. Two more things to give a shout out with this event sourcing. There's event sourcing Django, which is Python package for it with Django. Imagine that probably somehow integrates with the ORM. Don't know. But also event sourcing SQL Alchemy, which is kind of cool. So if you use SQL Alchemy, yeah, very nice. All right, so this stuff is great, but I imagine that it has times you should use it maybe more, and times you should go, well, square peg round hole, maybe not this time.
Sure. Yeah.
What do you think?
For me, I feel like it's usually the way I think about it first is because most people are very comfortable with not using event sourcing, right? And so I usually answer it the opposite way, which is when should you?
Sure, exactly.
The the best pieces of advice that I heard over the last decade was number one, use it. A good a good opportunity to use it is if you have a database column called status. Because if you have a column named status, then that means that one item can be in multiple different statuses, right? Different states. And if you're having different states, each states behave different in some way or form. And so you're definitely not dealing with true CRUD, create, read, update, delete patterns. And so event sourcing would be a great option for that. The second piece of advice is, are you ever concerned about losing data? Because by default, event sourcing does not. And what it enables you to do is choose when to lose data, right? Because you don't have to keep every event around forever. You can just say, like, after 90 days, let's just put it to cold storage or just delete it. It depends.
Yeah, exactly. Out in the audience, Mike says, I'm scared of the physical storage requirements of this potentially. And I guess it depends how many events make up a final state in your system. Like a cart checkout, big deal? No, probably not. Like,
Yeah.
if used as an app log, that might be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Most, I'll say models will have maybe a dozen events, maybe two, obviously depends on your domain. But ideally you will keep your events short, and they have practices called closing the books where you will use events in your domain to kind of keep it short. So like, for example, a store will want to know their revenue across the entire year, but every night they shut down, they get their cash registers, or if they still have cash registers, and they kind of reconcile how much money they made that day. And so, kind of keeping your event stream short really helps.
So if you're going to go back, you would just say, well, we'll just read the daily summary and then add today's events or something, like to get the final output, something like that.
Yeah, and unless you want to go all the way back to day one, in which case you can read and say like, okay, it all depends on how you want to do it, right? This is again the flexibility side of it, because you could just like say start from today and read forward, or you can start from today and say, okay, what was the event stream before this, and read that and keep going back to the originating. And I think you put up Mike's comment that said, I'm afraid of the physical storage requirements. And it's like, that is the trade-off. There is, it will take more space, but thankfully storage space is the cheapest commodity in all of online, or in today's world. And most
expensive is memory, and then compute, and then storage, and then bandwidth, and then storage. I think that's probably the breakdown, right?
Yeah, I think so. And
that's why things like disk cache are awesome versus like another thing that's just an in-memory cache, but another process, right? Like
exactly.
Yeah.
And having the ability to say like, what like my current application, I have not yet deleted any events, but truly like the only reason we have events older than even a week are just for analytical purposes and just me understanding how our system works. And so I'm planning to make a way to offload that event or those events. And a lot of people just put them straight to cold storage, just so that they always have a backup just in case, but chances are they rarely ever use it.
Sure.
So, and then one other thing I did want to add is to go answer your question, when not to use event sourcing.
Yes, exactly.
Would be essentially like, so let's say you don't care about losing data. There are just a number of just simple applications that are truly CRUD, right? Like I've worked on a number of these where they're just forms over data.
It's exactly the term I was thinking, forms over data. Define that for people if they don't know.
Yeah, it's essentially something where, like, in my case, one of the first ones I worked on is like you have a web page that almost exactly mirrors the database table that you're saving the data to. Maybe it's a contact form. Who knows what it could be? The idea is like there is the web UI or whatever you're building is just an easy way to get data into the database. And chances are you don't have status field. You don't have all these different ways of different rules for how things behave. And in fact, in my event sourced application, I have a model that is not event sourced. It is truly a CRUD model. And so just by saying, adopting event sourcing doesn't mean you have to do it for everything. You can use it for even just a small bit of your project, especially if you want to try it out and see how.
That's a really good point. Like, it's not an all or nothing sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because you have a properly factored data access layer, and you're not doing that inside of your Jinja template, are you? No.
Right.
Not even in your view, but like you've got just a an opaque layer of actions. Some of those actions can be driven by events. Some of those
Yeah.
actions can just be straight CRUD, create, read, update, delete, for those who don't know.
One of the people who inspired me to really dig into event sourcing, he has a line of business that he'll go to a company who is struggling because their database schema is holding them back. For whatever decision they made, they're having such a hard time creating a new feature because of their database schema. So he goes in, teaches them event sourcing, and uses the event sourcing event store to publish both the dream schema that they wish they would have and the old schema, and they live side by side. And the event, the once the features are complete, they'll put it up, and they'll start slowly migrating traffic over to the new event source version, and eventually they can delete the old database table or scheme or database. And most of the teams he's worked with have kept with the event source version and gone on from there.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah. Oh, and then finally, one other thing I want to mention too is when not to use is it's up to your teammates, because I am sold. I think this is such an incredible pattern. It is just unlocking so much joy again, and so much flexibility, as I've said before, that I cannot imagine having to go back. That said, if I join a new team and my team members are like, I don't know, I'm going to go with them.
Yeah. One thing is to not use an optimal pattern. What's worse is to try to use an optimal pattern, but have nobody else want to do it, and then they work around it. And it sounds a little similar to like people who don't want to do unit testing.
Yeah.
So some of the people write the unit test and they set up CI/CD that'll fail if the unit test fail, but then the other people will check in work without running the test at all, and then they break it, and you're like, "What are you doing?" Like, well, I don't want to run these crappy tests. You're like, well, now the whole CI/CD is not just not helpful; it's inhibiting me working because you won't even. I mean, it's just like, and it seems like you do need a certain level of buy-in for this to make sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And
maybe they should listen to this podcast and they can see.
Yeah. And maybe you create a example of one feature in an event sourced way so they can see some of the benefits. But
yeah, like your partial example, indeed.
Yeah.
All right, we're getting short on time here, Chris. But let's talk this AI flow. First of all, let's circle back to your comment of like your company having a mandate to use AI. Like what the heck is going on here? How was this received, and how are you receiving it? And also tell us, are you actually writing, shipping more features and being more productive or not? Like give us your assessment as much as you're willing to share. Like you don't have to divulge secrets or whatever.
Yeah. I will hide certain things, but to say
names and places have been changed to protect
and emotions
parties
and conversations with multiple other people. I would say at times I am so much more productive. At times it has brought down it does a really great job. And I think a lot of this has to do with the vertical slice architecture, because vertical slices only hold code that is responsible for one feature. And so that really fits very nice into a context window.
Yeah. It doesn't have to scan 200,000 lines and 100 files. It looks at 5.
Yeah. And it knows event sourcing. So it knows, okay, I'm subscribing to events. These are the events. I know where they are, all these different things. When I work on one of the other services, it takes a lot more context to understand the state of the code. And I really have to work harder to do what I need to do in those parts of the code base. Yeah. So it's been a very interesting experiment. And additionally, kind of when I had to curb this, but when I have been more productive is creating Git work trees. So it's like I have a kind of main repo that I work out of, and then if I have a feature that I'm like looking at the code base and I'm like, oh, or the web app or the logs, and I'm like, oh, it'd be good to like optimize this. Then I create a new work tree and set Claude up in there and get it working on a thing. And so I have found that I need to limit myself to 2 or 3 work trees, because any more than that, I start losing context. And now I know what the LLM thinks.
Yeah, exactly. If you overdo it, You just send off 5 agents and don't look. Like that's how you end up with like, oh, we have kind of like bugs in our code about architecture. It's like, well, if you never look at it,
Yeah,
it's like we got this super energetic, super smart intern and we kicked him off and said, go add that feature. But they need
exactly.
guidance, right?
All the tests are passing because I changed all the tests to pass.
I know. The problematic data has been removed from the database. It works now. Why is it empty?
Yeah.
Back to your backup comments. I honestly, I'm having like an insane amount of productivity with Claude Code and with AI and stuff, but it's an engineering skill. It is not just let's fire it up and ask for it. Like one of the things I'm doing lately that I'm really appreciating is going through like a planning session, which I know a lot of people do that and like talk about it, and now if you have the GitHub CLI installed, just the GH thing, you can tell it, hey, create, instead of just running this plan, create a GitHub issue of this plan, write all the details in GitHub, and then your next comment can be, let's work on issue 127. And it'll go work on it when it gets done. Like, let's make a retrospective comment on the issue. Let's create a PR that closes that issue. There's some really interesting team dynamics that you can put in there
Yeah.
that, talking to a chat box is not covered, but if
Yeah.
you know what to ask for.
Yeah, I'm really inspired by Martin and Adam because both of them, in one way or another, have. Well, let me take a step back. I mentioned the event modeling diagram. It is a visual diagram that really has a reduced visual language, and what was mind blowing to us a couple of years ago was that AI understands it, and so the fact that you can essentially say like, here's the diagram, can you implement the slice, and it can get you from, well, let me take a step back. Martin and Adam have both had successful research spikes where they took an event modeling diagram. Actually, no, they did even worse was they started with a conversation with the client and recorded it, created the
They generated the diagram.
Wow. And then generated code from the diagram that didn't solve everything, but got it, I think 80 or 85% of the way there in hours. Wow. From, like cutting months of work down to weeks is impressive. And I've had some similar, I'm still working on my personal one because like, I just, after work, I just tend to shut down my computers and I'm not like dedicated to like really going at it. But like, I found some really incredible benefits of doing something like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I created this open source project. I mean, it's more source open, whatever. It's not really a project, but I called it Python package guides for agents. And all the projects that I work on, I'll go and download the source and the documentation. So like if I'm working on disk cache, I'll like literally clone the documentation, and then make Claude write a super detailed, like not use their documentation or its old version, but like have it like legit write down examples, study the source code, study the documentation. Source code like trumps documentation because if the docs are out of date and so on. And then I'll drop, if I'm using like 2 of these, like maybe data classes and disk cache, I'll drop those things into my project and tell Claude about them. And that's a pretty neat thing to do as well.
Yeah.
But I want to leave this portion of our conversation with an incredible joke. Okay. Just because I feel like this has to be said right now. It's just so. The joke says the word Copilot. It could be Claude, it could be Codex, it could be chat, whatever. Like just AI, right? Friends outside of tech. Lol, Copilot is dumb. Friends in tech. I just bought iodine tablets and I've made an offer in land upstate. My supplies of antibiotics and potable water are sufficient, but I need to set up for the hydroponics to make it through the first few years. Like, I feel like that's where we are,
Yeah, totally.
And that maybe also sums up your meetup as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite a spectrum, both of friends outside tech and inside tech.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's more like believers and non-believers. I'm not really sure, but all right. Final call to action. What do we got here? People are interested. They want to get started. What do you tell them? Get your ebook, your free ebook that you put up.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. So my website is everydaysuperpowers.dev. If you want an ebook that kind of introduces you into event sourcing and kind of gives you kind of this kind of fundamental background and a couple other things, go to everydaysuperpowers.dev/ES intro, and it'll take you right there. I'm on Mastodon mostly, but I'm also Watch Blue Sky and sometimes X, underscore Chris May on all of those. With Mastodon, I think I'm on fostodon.org. What else? I mentioned Everyday Superpowers, so that's. I also have a Discord from there too. So if you go to my website, you can see how you can join that. Yeah,
Sweet. Maybe check out the event sourcing library if they're
100%.
Python people. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you the Martin and Adam have a podcast called the Event Modeling and Event Sourcing Podcast, which is verbosely named, but it also is really great. This is how I learn just from these great people.
There you go.
Just kind of almost every week talking about patterns they do and stuff like that. They also talk about a bunch of other stuff that isn't relevant, but I've learned so much from listening to them, and they also have Discords. So good.
Cool. I'm honestly impressed. Like an entire podcast on a single design pattern. Let's go. That's commitment to it.
Yeah, and it's incredible. Yeah, I mean, as someone who has played the board game and really enjoys it, it's amazing.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Chris, I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing all your experience and excitement and all the things. Great to talk to you.
Likewise, thanks for having me.